Thanks very much, Brian. And I want to thank the committee for the opportunity to be here and be of service tonight, and for all the hard work that's gone into this. I don't know if there's any committee members here, but it's remarkable when you look at it. And I really want to acknowledge Craig. I don't know if he's here, but it doesn't matter, for just an amazing talk. For just the most authentic talk I've ever heard. And it was just amazing. And I'm very grateful for that. And it was an inspiration. And the downside is, oh my God, having to follow him. So, look, I'm going to traverse as much territory as I can, short of a half hour. Because there's a big dance, I don't want to stop anybody from getting out and boogalooing their way into sobriety. Obviously, my story is my story, and it's a little different in one sense. I did come in very young. There was a time in Toronto when we were the youngest two members in 1970. And I came in March 1969. My very first meeting was the Ontario Regional Conference. I met John within a week. He's sitting over there, and he was at my home for Christmas in 1969 with my then young 21-year-old bride, and who was about to kick me out of the house because I said on my last drunk. So I just want to state for the record, I never, to the best of my knowledge, had a social drink. I simply drank for the effect, and I wanted to black out. I wanted to get shit-faced. The whole purpose of drinking was to get out of how I felt, which was like a fraud. I never felt normal. I never felt I belonged. I was raised, and I'll get to that in a few minutes, a very violent alcoholic home that looked really good on the outside. My dad was a very successful businessman, a civic politician. We lived in a beautiful home. I attended private schools. You would never know that anything was wrong with our family. And standing on the stairway, and I once had a doctor, Dr. Norbert Rosenberg, who some of the people in this room know who he was. He anglicized his name to Dr. Rose. And when I'd seen him for 3 years, and I too am in the entertainment industry. I've been a producer my entire life, and I started out in the rock and roll business in Los Angeles when I was a teenager. And eventually I went back to school, but this doctor, I was with him, and I'd been sober. I had changed my dry date after 17 years in AA. I never drank again, but I didn't quite get the memo on don't be sticking anything up your nose or smoking anything. And so, when I said to this doctor, when I got offered a position to help put CBC News World on the air, he said, you'll find a new therapist, not me. And I said, why? And he said, because you're going to die. And I said, what do you mean I'm going to die? He said, you'll never survive. So let me go back to the beginning. My first drink was a drunk. At the age of 12, standing on a stairway, my dad loaded 3 shells into a Remington shotgun, aimed it at my mother and I, and pulled the trigger. The gun jammed. He kept trying to get it to fire. My brother walked through the door, disarmed him, started to choke him to death, and my mother jumped on his back screaming, you're going to kill him. I'm thinking, kill him. Because I was so, at that point, damaged because I'd woken up at the age of 4 with a gun barrel at my head. And at the age of 12, finally the trigger gets pulled. And so the damage done to me, and I say that to you because it took me basically 17 years in Alcoholics Anonymous to understand that I could not have the recovery that other people had because the trauma was so severe. And that doctor said to me, who was trained with Eastern European, he was Czechoslovakian, with the survivors of the death camps, when I said to him, after this incredible career I had in film, the year before we'd been nominated for Best Picture and Best Actor in Los Angeles at the Golden Globes, and I'd had a film before that up for an Oscar, a documentary with my business partner. And I had this career that was on fire. And I said to him, well, how bad am I? And he said, you're the most damaged human being I've ever dealt with outside the survivors of the death camps. And I said, are you saying I can't get better? And he said, no. If somebody has to go to 1 or 2 meetings a week, you've got to go to 7. If somebody has to see me once a week, you need to see me 3 times. And he did that with me for a period of 5 years, at which time he weaned me off seeing him every other year, down to twice a week, once a week, then went to once a month. And at the end of 5 years, he said to me, you're now going to do the work you need to do. But every drink I took was simply to get drunk. And the month after the incident with my dad, we moved to Toronto from Northern Ontario. I don't know if anybody's here from Northern Ontario, but Timmins is where I was born. And at 12, we came down here. And 2 years later, my mom was diagnosed with cancer, very aggressive breast cancer. And I was put in a boarding school in North Bay, Schollard Hall. And at that boarding school, when they called me one night, Father Fady, and he said, it doesn't look like your mom's going to make it. We need to know where to put you, and we're thinking of putting you with your dad. And I just froze. I just couldn't say anything. And these older guys at the school said to me, we're getting a hotel room. Do you want to come with us? And I said, sure. And they said, we're going to get some booze. We're going to buy a case of beer and some alcohol. Do you want to get anything? And I said, yeah, absolutely. But I had no money. And I said, can anybody give me some money? And they said, well, we'll get it for you. And so they got a 24 of whatever it was, because I can't remember, but I got a bottle of lemon gin, the only drink I've ever drank in my life. And I just chugged it and swallowed it. And all I can tell you is that if you've ever seen the movie The Exorcist, it was like straight across the room, projectile puking. And to quote Craig in one of his lines, I woke up in a pool of urine and I pray it was mine. And I hated myself in the morning when I did that, because I had to go back to the school, and these guys said, man, you're an animal. Like, you should not drink. And I thought I would never drink again until I was in another private school here in Toronto. And I was with a group of guys, and this was a school for basically kids from wealthy, and my mother had to go back to work as a nurse. My dad lost everything and would end up dying an alcoholic death, poverty-stricken. And my mother managed to put together a very substantial legacy behind her. But she was head nurse at Sick Children's Hospital in the anesthetic department. And, that experience when I was at this private school, if anybody here ever went to Cantab or Meisterschaft, I changed high schools. I went to North Toronto Collegiate. I got drunk and drove my BSA 650 down the hallway, and the principal thought that was not a good idea and asked me to leave and go to Northern, which I did. And then Northern suggested I might want to go to another school because I would come back from lunch pretty juiced up. And I went to Meisterschaft first, and then I went to a little school called Cantab. And at Cantab, all of these kids that were there were from the most wealthy families in Canada, basically, and the most elite families. And I was sitting in a fellow's home in Forest Hill one night. We lived in Lonsdale and Lawton, and 3 blocks over on Dunvegan. I was sitting in this beautiful mansion, massive place. And on came my 3 sons, and on came a commercial for the GTO, 1964. And a week later, this guy already had a brand new Corvette Stingray, but a week later he got this GTO with 389 3.2s, which if you're a guy, you'll know what this was like with a 4-speed. And I said to my mother, I'm going to kill myself if you don't get me a car or a motorcycle. And my mother took me to Toronto Western Hospital to a psychiatrist through my sister, who was with the Addiction Research Foundation. And after 90 minutes, he called my mother and asked me to leave. And my mother would tell me later, he said, you better buy him a car or a motorcycle. And that's what it was like. But literally, I got on a train to drive up to Timmins to buy this motorcycle. I got so drunk, I got off in a blackout in North Bay, apparently stole a car and drove it up to Timmins. And they caught me because I had a school jacket on with a name. And I wanted to go to a dance at the now called the Shania Twain Center, but in those days I think it was the McIntyre Arena. And the police grabbed me and they took me downtown, and I had all this money on me to buy the bike in those days, like it was about $1,000 or $1,200. And they kept saying to me, where did you get the money? And I said, my mother gave it to me. What's your name? And I wouldn't tell them my name. And I forgot to mention that next door to us was a man who had become the Supreme Court of Canada Justice, and he was my brother's godfather. And the sergeant of detectives was on the board of directors of one of my dad's companies. And after 2 days of me not talking, Sergeant Gwala walked in and he went, David Brady, what are you doing here? And I went, and that was the end of my criminal career, 3 nights in jail. And somehow the charges evaporated and I was let go for lack of evidence in spite of being in the car and they got a jacket on the back. So, you know, that was the only time my dad ever did anything for me. He bought me a set of skis because at Scholar, because my roommate was go on to coach the women's Olympic ski team, and he taught me how to ski, and I actually became a really decent skier. So I worked every summer on the floor of the Toronto Stock Exchange. My brother had got me a position as a post boy, and then in 1969, or 67, pardon me, I went to Los Angeles with this friend John, and he and I were producing, and if you ever, anyone remember the band Lighthouse, the singer from it was Bob McBride. And Bob, we produced Bob's first album. I would produce his kid brother Danny, who went on to sing with Chris de Burgh. We did his album that got him a record deal at CBS. And, you know, at that point, I knew I couldn't drink anymore. And in 1969, I came here to the Royal York, and I had been on a 1-week binge. I said to my then bride, I'm just going out for a couple hours. So it was 4 or 5 days later I showed up. And I had drunk every day 20 to 30 draft beer, would get an occasional bottle of white Maraca rum with 7-Up, and then I got a bottle of J&B Scotch. And I can remember this so weirdly that I had that. And then a friend dropped some acid on me and a little bit of MDA on me. So that by the time my brother showed up at the foot of my bed, in March of 1969, he looked at me and he said, do you think you have a problem with alcohol, Dave? And I said, Robert, it's the only thing I got going for me. Because I felt that my life was over at 21. And he said, do you want to go to the Royal York? And I said, yes, I'd love to. Because I thought I was going for a drink. And I came in, and in that big room, if anybody remembers that big room at the Royal York, was a fellow who had been sober 15 years, living in an unheated cabin on Lake Simcoe, and he had developed a brain tumor. And I'm starting to come down from this stuff. And the walls are melting, people's faces are melting. And I'm thinking, where am I? And then he started to talk about feelings. I had 2 unlisted numbers, neither of which I would answer. I had a drawer full of mail because 18 months before that, I was cashing my baby bonus check and going down to the embassy and getting drunk on draft at 15 cents when I would get an $8 check, and I was a big shot wearing my school blazer with a tie. I mean, this was the insanity of it. And so I had no preparedness to be able to do anything that a mature human being would do. And I already had a child, and I'd been married a year. And my brother said, come on with me, and he took me down to the Royal York. And you know, when I heard him talk about feelings, I wouldn't have known an emotion if it had come up and got me with a 2x4. The only thing I understood was fear, rage, and lust. Other than that, there was no bandwidth for me to understand what compassion meant, what emotions felt like when it came to empathy, sympathy, or any of the related kinds of normal behaviors and feelings that we have as human beings. And that took me to North Toronto for my very first AA meeting. And you know, for the next 14 years, I came into AA to be successful. I wanted to be successful. And what happened is that I started devoting myself to being, in my mind, pursuing success. And so for 14 of the first 17 years, I paid no attention to any spirituality. I had been raised Irish Catholic. I was pre-Vatican II. Nobody ever did anything to me. They never were abusive to me in any way. Well, Dell, one of them, punched me out, but other than that, there was no real any kind of abuse of any kind. but it's just I couldn't. I was raised on a God that was going to burn me when I discovered sex. And they said, if you even think about it, it's a mortal sin. And I mean, that's all I thought about from about the age of 12 till about 20 minutes ago. And I, sit around looking at a couple of frisky 6-year-olds go, ooh, that's nice. But I mean, this is a normal thing for me. I'm just a normal human being. And yet, I was filled with this guilt and shame over being normal. And so I did not pursue any of the spiritual principles. I did not understand what a character defect was. I could not fathom what they talked about in steps 6 and 7. I just didn't get it. There was no capability. I believe the reason I never drank is because I did a really thorough 4th and 5th step initially. But I was Catholic, so I was used to confession. But I sat down with this fellow and I did it. And, Terry, our friend Terry W., who was my original sponsor. I've only had 3 sponsors in my life in the 53 years I've been around AA. I never stopped coming to AA. I drove people crazy. I was a lot of people's tolerance sponsor. And I eventually, and 3 years after I got into AA, I found a letter. My wife was having an affair. I was 24, and I was devastated, and I was really angry. And I thought, I was literally hiding outside looking at the house thinking, I'm going to kill her. And then I said to my sponsor, I think I want to kill my wife, or I want to go to university in Vancouver. And he said, let's talk about Vancouver. And so I left, and I went out to Vancouver. And I'd done a couple of years of journalism. And I got to Vancouver, and I started to do my undergraduate, and then I went on to graduate school in communications. And I made a film in graduate school called Alcohol, Drugs, and the Young. I was going to be a therapist. This is me out of my mind, but I was going to be a therapist. And I made this film, and my graduate advisor said, why aren't you in film? I said, nobody would let me in. And I essentially started to work on what it was I wanted to do. And if anybody remembers the Beachcombers, I wrote a script for that. And the editor of it found it, and he said, look, we can't. This is way too advanced for these people. We can't. I'd given the kid an alcohol problem. One of them had a gambling problem. And he said, but the script's amazing. I got somebody for you to meet. And he introduced me to a young man named Philip Borsos. And Philip Borsos and I got together. And the short story is that he and I, our first film was nominated for an Academy Award in the documentary category. And then we did a feature after that the critics gave 100%. It's on Rotten Tomatoes at 100%. The government made a stamp out of it, and it catapulted us into, and it's funny, at dinner, we were talking about this tonight, how I always thought if I could just get fill in the blank, the right relationship, the right degrees, the right house, the right car, that my life would be perfect. And what I discovered, living in a beach house in Malibu, a beautiful home in West Vancouver on the ocean, an apartment in Manhattan, and a house here in Toronto, is that I was never as unhappy as the year we got nominated for the Best Picture, and I was ready to commit suicide. That was talked about again tonight. And I really thought seriously about offing myself. And, I'm grateful to say that I shared that with someone who said to me, this is not a good idea. And so I had to come back, and I made a decision at my home group, which was Saturday Night Malibu, to change my dry date. Because I came back to Toronto, and a friend of ours, Mort, got me involved in adult children of alcoholics. And that was the beginning of me healing the effects of growing up in an alcoholic family. And I found, and they know today from the science, that those of us sitting in the room, most of us, not all of us, there's a significant number of people who come out of loving, kind, and good families. But the majority of us come out of homes at some form of either physical, emotional, spiritual, sexual, or some form of weird abuse. And that is that responsible for us being alcoholics? I would say that it plays a significant part because most of us had a precursor, including the predisposition to the genetic problem of becoming an alcoholic. So it's a combination of those. And to make it simple, I started going to adult children of alcoholics in Al-Anon. I've spent 36 years in both those programs, where I have learned how to deal with the effects and the problems that have been created. And I saw that Dr. Rose, and he said to me when I went to see him, you can't go back to Los Angeles. You have to stay here and do the work. And I have no idea why I listened to him, but I did. And I remember he said to me, you have to get a recovery job. And I had no idea what he meant. And I remember my then wife saying to me, well, you can take the subway down. And I was pounding my chest going, you don't understand who I am. And she said, I know exactly who you are. And she said, you can still take the subway. And it was like, for me, so freaked me out, this idea that I would take public transit. Today, I love it. But back then, the ego was so twisted and so weirdly strange that I couldn't imagine. It was a sign of failure to me. And through the good graces of Dr. Rose, I started to really got a new sponsor, Mort. I started to do the work on the steps, and I went through from step 1 to step 12 in AA. I went through step 1 to step 12 in ACA. I did the Al-Anon, and if anybody wants to, you want to challenge, do the Al-Anon 4-step blue book. Like that sucker just about buried me. And yet, it was the key to relieving me of the power of the past to haunt me. You know, and the greatest gift I had after a number of years is, you know, I had a daughter that was so angry at me, it took her 17 years to forgive me. And what happened is that when she turned 40, I said to her and her brother, I said, my first kids from that first marriage, I said, do you want to know why I left? And they said, yeah. And I said, because I found this letter and your mom was having an affair and I didn't know how to deal with it. I was 24 years old and they're now 40. And when she was dying, I was the only one of her 5 exes that was there holding her as she was sobbing. And that was one of the greatest gifts I've had, to be able to be there with her, because she was my childhood sweetheart from 15. And it was a gift that I was able to do that. And you know, that amend in front of her, with her in front of my daughter just broke down. And that was the beginning of the healing of that part of our relationship. And what I can tell you is that I have gone through, on average, once a year, at least one of the 12-step programs. I usually do 2. I usually do AA and either Adult Children or Business Debtors Anonymous, because at my bottom, after 17 years, I ended up on a project that was a crash and burn on a feature film. I paid for the money in the States. We'd had all these successful films. I ended up being sued by 605 people. I had to make amends to the state of Washington. And, you know, when you find yourself on the front of the New York Times with the film that bounced, and the Globe and Mail, Brian had to write a letter for me about 36 years ago explaining what had happened. The New York Times would not publish it. The Globe and Mail, to their credit, did. And, you know, it was so humiliating to me. I never thought I would overcome that. And yet, that was the catalyst for the greatest change in my life. That was what brought me to my knees. It had me recognize how powerless I was and that on my own I could not find a solution. Because it turned out I was very intelligent, which I didn't believe. I was told every day of my life how stupid I was. But in fact, I was gifted. And the thing about this is when my children, you know, my second family, how I got faith is that my young son, when he was born, he was going north, his feet were going south. He had 180-degree club feet, and I had to take him to Sick Children's Hospital every week. And they would take his feet twisted 180 degrees and put him in a cast, and he would scream in agony. And at 6 months, they cut him from stem to stern across the back of his heel, stuck steel pins through the back of his ankle. And when I took him back to the hospital 3 weeks later, he just started flailing with these little casts on his feet. And I'm telling you, I just couldn't. I just sobbed. And the surgeon said, you've got to hold him down for me. I need him to be held down while they cut the casts and put his feet back in and put new casts on. And that was the moment I realized Brendan Brady's little brain trying to understand how this person that seemed to love him so much would do so much to hurt him. But he didn't understand that I wasn't willing to let him go through life crippled. And what happened is simply that at that moment it hit me, because I had always said, if there's a God, why do people go through fill in the blank? You know, I cannot understand a higher power's purpose in being on the planet, except that every time I've done this, and I still was reluctant to God until my daughter Laurel was born. And Deb was directing, my then wife, Deb, many people in the room know her, who was directing a show in London, Ontario for Second City. And she said to me, I drove down from Toronto and met her there in London, and she said, geez, I'm not feeling well. And I said, well, let's call the doctor. She said, no, it's okay. And I said, no, let's call the doctor. And so we called the doctor. It turned out she was in labor, but it was only between her 24th and 25th week of gestation. And so we got her to the hospital in London, Ontario, and she went in immediately for an emergency C-section. And, you know, that was the most horrific experience I'll ever have, because I couldn't even see. She was so small when they brought it out of her. And I said to the doctor, is she okay? Is she alive? And he said, look, we don't know. We've never saved a baby this small. And I went down and I sobbed in a bathroom. And I'd never cried from the time I was 12 till that moment. And I couldn't stop crying. And all I did, people were pounding on the door saying, are you okay in there? And, you know, they said to us, she was in intensive care for 3 months. They said cerebral palsy, probably blind, developmentally challenged. It'll not be good. And I prayed and said, God, if you let her be okay, I promise. And I've never broken that promise to this day. And what I can tell you is she ended up beautiful, graduating the top of York University, and was last year emerging writer for Telefilm Canada, an amazing career. And her brother has got this amazing career. For anybody that's a fan of either Letterkenny or Shoresy, that's his shows, you know, and it's just, he's the producer of those. And I look at my kids and I think, thank you, God, for the gift that you've given me. Sobriety has been the greatest gift I've ever had. I discovered that all that stuff that I went after, and I'll close in a minute with this, but, you know, I remember getting this really amazing car. I always wanted this car. And, like, I was driving, it was 3 weeks later, driving down the road, and I saw, I got black sunroof. I mean, it had everything you can imagine. And then I saw this one go by with a different plate on it. And I went, why didn't I get that one? I have a mind that is never satisfied if I'm not in a state of spiritual well-being. If I don't pay attention to the 12 steps, if I'm not in service in Alcoholics Anonymous, if I'm not out helping others, and I take men through the big book one at a time, if I'm not doing that, if I'm not at a home group setting up the chairs, I made coffee at my little group. We bought a house in the country. I made the coffee there for 8 years. You know, my group in West Vancouver, I set up the chairs every week for 8 years. Being of service is the key to happiness. Humility is the key to happiness. Being sober is the key to happiness. Thank you very much.